Welcome everyone. As I mentioned in the last video, there is a revolution in Russia in February 1917. That's the overthrow of the monarchy and the beginning of the republic. So just keep in mind that is not the communist revolution. The February 1917 revolution is an overthrow of Nicholas and the monarchy and the creation of the republic, which is a multi-party system, and the provisional government is writing the constitution. And I mentioned that the Bolsheviks and Lenin are the one group that is outside, and so can promise people that if they just supported them, just supported Lenin and the Bolsheviks, everything would be better. So I want to talk a bit about what Lenin does and why he assumed that Russia could go into a communist revolution even though it is not very industrialized. So there's Lenin, our picture of Lenin. So Lenin assumes a kind of change to Marxist theory. So if you remember, when we talked about Marxism, Marx thought that you would eventually get a majority of the workers, and that would be the majority of the population of the country, and they would overthrow the owners, the bourgeoisie, the small group, and then they could move to communism. Well, Russia has very, very few workers. It's not very industrialized yet. And so in many ways, it's more in the stage when the bourgeoisie overthrow the aristocracy. So it's going to have to jump really far forward to hit a Marxist revolution. So what Lenin did, though, is he changed things. And he said, you know what? Yes, Russia is not very industrialized, and we don't have a very strong working class. But the U.S. does. And France does, and Britain does, and Germany does. Lots of countries do. So what would happen if Russia rose in the workers' revolution, and then the other countries who were more advanced capitalist countries saw that? The workers in those countries would then rise in rebellion because they would think, well, hey, if Russia can do it, we can do it. So the idea here is that Russia would be the spark that triggered the worldwide workers' revolution to bring in a communist world. So that's why he's doing it. He knows in Marxist theory, Russia's not really ready for the revolution, but he makes this change. So that is a very significant and important change. So the Bolsheviks then, in October 1917, overthrow the provisional government. Now, they're only in control of St. Petersburg and Moscow, just the capitals. So that's what they have. But here is the plan. If you remember in the last video, I mentioned that the provisional government had planned to have an election in the fall of 1917. Now, what Lenin wants to do then is to overthrow the government, the provisional government. Then the world is going to see, or the industrialized countries are going to see, that a communist revolution has just happened in Russia. They will rise in rebellion. And meanwhile, that will end the war because the workers aren't going to fight the workers. They understand that that's all bourgeois manipulation. The war will be ended. The more industrialized countries like the US and the UK will come to help Russia, and everything will be better right away. And that means that for the elections in November, because elections are going to be in November, the Bolshevik Party would have just done this amazing thing. They would have ended the war, aid would be coming in, everything would be great. So this is why for Lenin it's very, very important to overthrow the government in October, to seize the capitals, the dual capitals, because within just a few weeks after that, everything's going to change. And then, of course, the Bolsheviks would win the election, because everyone would love them. Woohoo! The problem is going to be, and I hope you know your US history at least enough to know, there was no worldwide workers' revolution in 1917. And so Lenin kind of has to go into a holding pattern for a little bit because he's waiting for the worldwide revolution to happen. And it's not happening. So I want to talk about some of his mistakes that he makes, because he's having to try to hold this government together, waiting for an event that's not happening. And Russia is actually going to go right from World War I into a civil war. In the elections that happened in November, the Bolsheviks do not win the majority. They win more votes than they would have potentially had the October Revolution not happened, but they certainly don't win control of the legislature in this new democracy that is in place. And so when the new legislature meets in January, Lenin just shuts it down. And that's it. That's the last free multi-party election until the 1980s. That's it. For Lenin, though, this was supposed to be just a temporary measure because he was shutting down the legislature. But this is going to be a democracy. It's going to be a democracy when the people vote the way they should vote, which, of course, is for the Bolshevik Party, which will happen as soon as the Worldwide Workers' Revolution happens. But a lot of people got really upset because Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had been saying this was going to be a democracy, and it's not. So they're not very happy. Second, remember that peace land bread issue? He signs a peace treaty with Germany. Now, for Lenin, this makes perfect sense because of the fact that when the Worldwide Workers' Revolution happens, of course, Germany will not hold Russia to this horrible treaty. Russia loses a fourth of its land and a third of its population to Germany. So because it's the western part of Russia that's transferred to German control, and that is where the best farmland is, the most of the industry, and also the largest population. So, but for most people, they see this in Russia that they've lost. Millions and millions of people have died for nothing because now Russia has lost the war. When they heard peace, when Lenin said peace land bread, they understood victory land bread, not losing land bread. And the third major problem is the economy is still in shambles. People are in horrible working conditions. They don't get increases in pay. There's still not enough food. There's still all kinds of problems with the military. This is just with the soldiers coming home, right? The war is over, but the soldiers are coming home. And so most people are really ticked off. And so it's probably not too surprising that in 1918, Russia goes into a civil war because they don't know any other way to get rid of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So this is the Reds versus the Whites. The Reds being the Bolsheviks, and the Whites being everybody else, everybody who hates the Bolsheviks. And there's this horrible civil war. Now, World War I was awful for Russia, but civil wars by definition are always worse because everyone who dies and all the territory that's destroyed is in your country. So here we go. Now, in many ways, it's not so much that the Reds win as the Whites lose. So let's talk about the Whites, the We Hate Lenin groups. Now, first of all, one of the problems with the Whites is they're not unified. Some Whites want to go back to a monarchy. Some Whites want a republic where only rich men vote. Some people want a democratic republic with a full vote for all men and, crazily enough, women. And other people want different social experiments, social parties. Like they don't like Marxist communism, but they want other types of socialism. And some of the monarchy people don't want Nicholas, but they want a different monarch. So they just totally do not agree. And whenever one of those parties, one of those groups starts to gain too much land, then they get undermined by the other Whites. Okay, now the Bolsheviks are all united. They're united under Lenin and Trotsky and the other leadership of the Bolsheviks. But the Whites are fighting each other as much as they're fighting the Reds. And that is not good. The other major problem is the foreign intervention. Now, the picture in this slide is U.S. troops that have invaded Russia. The United States invaded Russia in 1918. And so did France, and so did Britain, and so did Japan. And we invade to restore the provisional government, to overthrow the Bolsheviks, to bring Russia initially back into the war. Because the war is not over at the point in time this happens. World War I is still happening, and we needed Russia back in the war. Then it continues even after the end of World War I, and the attempt is to defeat the communist government and to restore a liberal democracy. or to put in a liberal democracy. Now, the reason this is important is that we never really sent that many troops, but we sent enough troops that Lenin could play the nationalism card. Should it really be the United States and Britain that decides what kind of government Russia has? And do you really think they'd leave once they come in? If they win, I mean, this is the period of imperialism. Who's going to say that Britain will ever really leave? Or maybe it'll just divide Russia up the way that China got divided up. Right? This is a threat. So maybe you don't believe in Bolsheviks and in Lenin, but if you believe in the right of Russians to decide what happens in Russia, then you should support Lenin, not these groups that help to bring in a foreign invasion. And that would be the word they would use, invasion, not intervention. So the U.S. troops are there. I should mention that this whole episode gets pretty forgotten in American history. And in fact, in the 90s, the families of these soldiers, both in England and to an extent a little bit in the U.S., asked that they get remembered. They tend to not be remembered in World War I memorials and that kind of stuff because they fought in Russia. But anyways, these kind of two issues, the fact that the whites are often fighting the whites and the fact that the foreign intervention does not much more than send people to the reds, means that the whites are going to lose. And in 1922, the Civil War is over and the Bolsheviks are in control. Amazingly. No one would have really thought that would happen in 1917, but it does. But the other thing that has happened in 1922 is the world revolution has not happened. And so basically what Lenin is forced to do is to try to create a system that is kind of communist and kind of not communist economically. There's still private ownership and there's not. And basically kind of just stay in this holding pattern. It sometimes is called the New Economic Policy, NEP, the New Economic Policy. And this idea is this kind of just holding until they can figure out what to do. Now, Lenin's going to have a series of strokes, and he's going to die in January of 1924. But at least there's some stability in Russia at that point in time. But what's going to happen to the communist revolution is still a major open question.